Process Mining Café. Today I'm here with Rudi, just the two of us. Hi, Rudi.
Hi everyone.
Yeah, so we're doing a solo episode just to get you in the right mood for Process Mining Camp. Of course, we're in the middle of our last preparations for Process Mining Camp, so stay tuned for the final program, which will be published next week. And also don't forget to sign up if you haven't bought your ticket yet. The springtime saver rate still applies until Friday next week, so a little bit more than a week. So where you can get, I think at the moment, still 300 euros discount. So yeah, get your ticket before then. And we are looking forward to seeing you all in Eindhoven. So it will be a really great camp this year. And right, Rudi, we are having the preparations at the moment for this year's camp. It's very practical. So yeah, we already talked about this in the past weeks. So we are going to do workshops. The second day is a full day of 3 workshops in sequence with a lot of hands-on work on how you do a process mining analysis, how you prepare the data. And in this spirit, we thought, well, to get into the mood for camp, we're also doing a hands-on episode here today for you. And we are going to talk about variants. And yeah, variants are a really interesting concept for process mining. Of course, we're always talking about the process discovery and the process maps, but the variants are kind of a separate dimension to look at the process more from this kind of variant, scenario-based variant analysis. And yeah, we will talk about all of this in this cafe today. And of course, you can participate. So if you're watching this live at the moment, here on this very same page, just below, you can go into the chat. You don't need an account, just type in your name. You don't need a password, and you're in the chat, and you can talk with us while we're on the air. We will keep an eye on what you're saying, and we're also curious about your experiences. So for example, we are very curious what types of analysis you are typically doing with variants. And also, if you have examples for processes where you saw that the variation was particularly high compared to maybe more standard processes, and any other questions that you can imagine. So yeah, let's get started right away. And Rudi, we wanted to start by talking a little bit about the difference between variance and variation, right?
Yeah. So there's a little bit of misconception, right? So if you talk about variance, then people think often, especially in the Lean Six Sigma domain, about the statistical aspect of it, right? So the dispersion or the part, the aspect between the median and the spread of the value, and that's not the case for the process mining exercise, right? So the variation kind of gives you more an impression of what your data set represents from a process point of view. So how complex is it? So that's kind of what you see. And often what I see myself doing is, after looking at the process map and playing with the sliders a bit, the variation, or at least the case variance, give me kind of an idea of how the process is kind of distributed and which kind of next steps I need to take in order to do a meaningful analysis.
Yes. And so to make clear what we are talking about, let's maybe look at an example right away. So I'm going to share my screen here, and we can start with a purchasing process, for example. This is the process from the tutorial in our process mining book, where we have a case ID, which is the purchase order number. We have a start and a complete timestamp. We have the steps that are happening in the purchasing process, the people who are performing the steps, and their organizational role, right? So these are the elements. And of course, for process mining, we need the case ID, activity name, and timestamp, and we can import the data, and then we see the process map here, right? So I'll show all the details by looking at 100% of activities and path. And so what you mentioned just really right is that you're going, you're not just looking at the map, but you're looking at the cases view to look at the variance. And maybe before I forget one thing I wanted to mention based on what you just said about that the concept of variation linked to the Lean Six Sigma field, right? I think one difference while we are looking at variance differently in the process mining world is that in the typical Lean Six Sigma kind of analysis, often you look at the process, for example, in a value stream mapping exercise as something which is relatively fixed, right? So you have a certain sequence of steps that are expected in a certain order, like, for example, in a manufacturing environment. But what we're looking at with process mining is the different sequences of steps. So we expect there to be a variation in how the process can be performed. So it's not just a sequence, but as we see in the map here, there's, for example, rework, but there's also different paths that you can go because different people perform different views, right? But in the map, you have everything in one picture, whereas with the variance, you can look at the separate scenarios, right? So this is what you were referring to, right, Rudi, here?
Yeah, and also there's a difference between what comes out of the process, right? Mm-hmm. So if we are looking at variation from a more statistical point of view, then we can look at the distribution, for example, of the processing time of the full process, right? And that also has a minimum value, it has a maximum value, and somewhere a median and an average. So it has a particular spread of variation, but that's not what we're looking for. We are looking for the different variants you can have about the execution in the order in which these activities are executed.
Yes.
And this is very specific for process mining.
Yes, or another outcome-based example would be, if there's sufficient quality, or quality is good or bad or something, right? So then you could have a distribution for that. But here we're really looking at the steps in the process, of course.
Yeah, and the difference is also it's not a measurement, right? So it's not a statistically evaluated number we have, but it actually happened, right?
Yeah,
so it's based upon the actual data, on the reality. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So and then here we can explain what we mean, right? So here we see, for example, there are 608 cases in the whole data set. So there are 608 purchase orders for this data set here. But then with the variance, we are looking at sequences. So we are looking at, for example, all the cases that follow these 18 steps in exactly the same order, right? So it's a sequence of steps, the same steps, but also in the same order from the beginning to the end of the process. And then, of course, you can have multiple cases that follow exactly the same path through the process from the beginning to the end. So they will be grouped into the same variant. So here we can see variant 1 covers 15% of the process, variant 2 covers 13%, and then variant 3 still 10%.
Yeah, and here on the right side, you can see the sequence, right? So now you see that variant 3 is composed of these two steps, going from create purchase requisition to analyze purchase requisition, and then no other activity is actually happening. Yeah. And then we can see that we have 63 separate cases that have the same pattern. So it looks for patterns.
And let's also mention that in the second column, where you can, on the left side, you can select the variant. In the second column, you have then all the cases that are grouped in the same variant, right? So these are the 63 cases that all follow exactly just these two steps in the same way. And maybe to make the link back to the process map, of course, it's just a different way of looking at the process, right? So if you're looking at the map, we are also looking at these 608 cases, but they're all folded into the same map, and we can find back the variance in the map, but you can see that it's not always completely a one-on-one view, right? So for example here, if we're looking at this variant 3, then we see the process starts with create purchase requisition, then analyze purchase requisition, and then nothing else happens. So in the map we can see this. It starts at the top, then we have analyze purchase requisition, and then with the dotted line we are going towards the end point of the process, so nothing else happened. But if we're looking at the numbers, right, then we see actually 64 times the process ended after analyze purchase requisition. But variant 3 only has 63 cases. So it's not just variant 3 which is kind of causing this, but if we, for example, click on this end path, we can just take a look. And then we see, okay, there's actually one case where we had this additional step, right, which was a little bit different. So that's how you can see it's not always like one-to-one, but the variants are a more sequential way of looking at the process. So then maybe the next step would be to talk a little bit about the different natures that we have for different types of processes and data sets. Right, so here we have this purchasing process, but we have some other data sets, right, Rudi? Maybe we can bring them in and look at them.
Yeah, sure.
Let's, for example, take a look at the refund process. Here we have, that's a refund order number. Then here we have the activity of the service employee who's handling the refund. It's a refund from an electronics manufacturer. We have one timestamp here, and then the refund order can come through different channels. And again, we have a process map which actually looks quite readable. But if we look at everything here, we actually have the classical spaghetti process.
This is very common, of course. That's happening. Yeah.
Let's bring that back again. So here we have, for example, 1,338 cases and 446 variants.
Yeah. And of course, if we look at the complexity, often this variation is coming from somewhere, right? So that's also in this particular example. So if we go to the map again, and if we pull up the path slider, and then often it gives you already a little bit of an indication where variation could come from, right? So one of the things to look for example, does it start at one given point? In this particular case, it's already quite easy because we have one starting point as part of the process. But we can see that there's a lot of complexity at the end point. There are a lot of dotted lines going to the end of the process. Yeah. And every time when we have a different endpoint, of course, it also creates a new variant because it has a different sequence because it ended at a different endpoint. Yeah. And so the process map can help us to understand the variation, but it's not the complete story explaining every variant.
Yeah. And depending on the type of process, you sometimes have some dominant variants. So here, for example, the most frequent variant has 13%. It's already less than before, right? So if we're looking at the purchasing process, the most frequent variant had, it's similar, 15, 13, 10. Sometimes you have a dominant variant, which is maybe 25% or more, right? So that depends how the process is structured. But then we have another example, right, Rudi, where it's even more distributed.
So I cannot see the screen anymore because it's frozen at my end.
Okay.
Unfortunately, at the moment.
Okay, so I think it's still visible for the viewers. So let's continue. But I can tell you. So so I have the screen now for the import screen for the this is the data set. What's the data set that we are looking at here, Rudi? It's from a clickstream analysis, right? From a website?
Yeah. So we have a data set from an unemployment benefit agency in the Netherlands. So when you are unemployed, then you apply for unemployment benefits. In the Netherlands, it's a government agency. And this is a clickstream data set. So this clickstream data set is containing of interactions that take place from each individual that visits the website, and then it clicks on certain pages, and the trail of these pages kind of creates the variant which the user goes through. Yeah. And that's what we see. So the case
just
ID
to mention
here,
the touch point is then what people are clicking on, right? It's the pages they're visiting, basically. And that's the activity.
Yeah, and in this particular example, there is an URL there as well, right? So they abbreviated the URL to one single page name, but they also have combined this with questions, right? So you can ask a particular question through another channel, and this is also part of the activity, and that's together mixed as a touch point. So that's why they refer it as a touch point and not only a click.
Yeah, so let me import the data set, and then we can show how this looks like. So then, we're looking at all of these different clicks and looking at the map. And then we get a first overview, which looks also quite readable, right? So Disco always makes a process map as a starting point that's simplified to a certain level. But what we can see already is that the activity slider is very, very low. It's just at 12%. So here there's many more activities in this data set because, of course, of the process, right? On the website, you can visit many different pages, so it's logical.
Yeah. And you can see it. So if you go to the statistics here and then go to the activity, and this is very typical of this clickstream type of data, right? Some pages are more popular, right? So if you hit the landing page, the home page, of course, it will be visited much more times compared to very exceptional error pages, for example. And that's what you see here in the distribution below. So, for example, task or taken, as in Dutch, is visited the most times. But if you scroll down, then you see these pages which are become very exceptional. And maybe there are also some pages which just visited once, right? So these are very exceptional. And then you can think about strategies to simplify this. For example, by excluding some of these low ranked pages. And that's also what the activity slider is doing, of course.
Yeah, but we can also see just in the nature, if we're looking at the variance, then we actually see that, from these, in this case, it's 1,000 cases because we took a sample from the full data set. And for the 1,000 cases, there are 983 variants. So it's almost like a one-on-one.
It's almost one-to-one. Yeah, and this is not an exception, right? So this is quite typical, and we see this in particular use cases, right? So user interactions is one, but also in healthcare we see similar things happening, right? So looking at all the actions or activities that happen in a hospital, if you put them into a sequence for a patient, then you see this, the similar view where each patient has their own route going through their healthcare process.
Yeah. Exactly. So what you can see is that the variance is we get the variance out of the process mining analysis together with the process map. So it's a different type of complementary information that we have about the process, but we can use it in different ways. So for example, the variance can be a useful tool also to simplify process maps, right? We have seen just before that, there we can very quickly have this kind of spaghetti process. So for example, for this refund process from this electronics manufacturer, if I look at the full process with all of the path and all of the activities, we have this spaghetti problem. But there's different ways to deal with this and to simplify the map. And first of all, I can do this, for example, based on the reducing the path, showing not all of the path, but showing just the main path through the process. So this is one way, a quick way to simplify the process map. But the variance can also be a way to look at the process and to say, well, let me just look at the process based on the most common scenarios. I'm not interested in those kind of very rare, unique kind of paths that are taken, but I want to just see what are the main scenarios, the main flows through my process. So what I can do instead here is that I can also say, well, let's use the variance to simplify the process, right? So it's an alternative method to simplify. And for this, I can use a filter that's the variation filter. So if I click in the lower level, the filter symbol here in the lower left corner, and then I can use the variation filter. And here in the variation filter, right, it's often a little bit, people are surprised, right, really, that you have this kind of U shape.
Yeah, exactly.
Can you explain what the why we see
Yeah,
this.
it's not it's not always a U shape, right? But in this case, it is traditionally on the right side. You see the more common behavior. So that's often how I explain it, right? So what happens most frequently as a variant? So which sequences happen most frequently? And on the left side, it's the exceptional behavior. So of course, we have a lot of these variants which are unique. So have a unique sequence to the process. And these variants are grouped indeed by the peak on the left side, right? So the peak on the left side is represented by all the unique sequences going to the process. And the peak in the distribution on the right side is represented by the common behavior. So these are the top variants. And instead of selecting individual variants, because that's also possible, right, in Disco to filter these out, you can do this based upon a percentage. So if you want to have an 80-20 or 60-40, or in this case, 30-70, then you can easily filter out the common cases as part of the process map.
Yes, exactly. So if we focus on the main variants here, for example, these are then the top 5, all of the cases that are frequent enough that they group at least 50 cases. So they are not exceptional scenarios, but at least 50 cases have followed exactly the same sequence. We want to use them to show the process. Then we could say these are the top 5 variants, for example. And then what you see here now is that we have actually removed all the other variants. So we are only looking at the top 5 variants, and we are only looking at 30% of the process as a result. But now if we go to the process map, also, of course, the process map only shows the process map based on these top 5 variant. And now it's actually very easy to pull up the path slider and the activity slider and to look at the full picture. And one advantage of this way of simplifying based on variants is that you can create a process map that is in itself consistent, right? If you start adding up the numbers, they add up to 100%. For example, here, if you add up 223, 69, 108, you will arrive at 400, right? So, and that can be a confusion that you have, that you encounter if you are looking at the process by just leaving out some path. For example, if you lower the path slider to leave out some details, then you have some situations where the numbers don't add up, right? So for example, here we see that request rejected L3 is an activity that occurred 4 times in total. But we came in twice from this activity. Afterwards, we went twice to this part of the process. But something is missing, right? So we apparently also ended up here twice from a different place, and we went to a different place. And of course, I mean, if we would pull up the path slider and we could look at it, for example, request rejected L3, then here we can see everything, right? So we see, for example, once we are coming from request signed L3, another time we are coming apparently from request signed L1, and then there's also different outgoing places, once to order completed and once it was the last point. But now we get back with spaghetti, right? So clearly, if you're just leaving out some paths, then you're not seeing a process map that is in itself consistent, and that can create problems if you create a map that you show someone else who's not a process mining analyst and who doesn't know how this all works, and maybe you have found a problem in your process and you want to show this to them and talk to them about this pattern that you have discovered and you think it's a problem, and they listen to you, and after some while you notice they're maybe a little bit distracted, and then the question comes, but how should I read this map? Do the numbers add up, right? And it's very natural that someone who's really new to process mining, that they want to understand what they're looking at, so they're trying to add up the numbers, and then they if they don't, then they're a little bit confused and they want to know what is this. And then you have to talk about spaghetti processes and, how it's not possible to show everything, but it's distracting from what you actually want to do. So that's an advantage of simplifying based on the variance. And here we took 30%, but you can like Rudi said, we can increase it, right? Maybe we can go to 50 or 70. Let's see what 40% look like.
It's dynamic.
Yeah. So now we are with more, not just the top, but it's still very readable, right? But
and what I find the most powerful of this variation filter is often these first top variants are something people already know, right? Because these explain the most common behavior. And so if you are looking for common mistakes, right? So then you can also leverage this variation filter. So if you now go back to the variation filter, and then if you change it and then move the right slider a little bit to the left, so remove that top distribution on the right side, a little bit underneath. So it's still mainstream, but we cut off the main variance, right? So then we try to find the point where we leave out the most common behavior, but look a little bit at the exceptions, which are still common, right? So if we want to make a big impact, we still want to look at common behavior, but we don't want to take in the mainstream part of it.
Yeah, exactly. So you can really choose what you're looking at in this, and looking at the main or at the middle parts or the more exceptional ones. But at the same time, you can also see the disadvantage if you're focusing just on variance, you're not seeing everything, right? So that's I think one of the advantages if you're looking at the whole map is that you can see even very rare activities. For example, this activity request rejected L3, we can see it in the map, right? Although it will never be in the top 20 or even the top 30 variants, because it's exceptional behavior, but you can see it there. So it's not that, variants are better than other simplification methods, but they have certain advantages and you can use them all in your toolbox.
Yeah, and then it breaks down, right? Because in this particular example, it works, because there was some variation. But if you look at the UEV example, which we have,
let's look at that.
With the unemployment benefits, it doesn't work anymore because we have that one-to-one relationship between cases and variance. So we can try to apply the variation filter, but there is no commonality based upon the variance.
There are no main variants in this sense.
Exactly. So that's one of the reasons why looking at the variance is often the second thing what I do besides looking at the process map, because that gives me an impression, does it still need work before I actually can make sense of the variance? Or is it already at that level where I can start discovering things that are relevant? And in this particular example, I kind of argue that it still needs work, right? We still need to have more focused on the data set before I actually can make sense of the variance, because the variance itself, it says something about the route, in this case, an individual took. But there is no commonality between these variants, between each individual user. And that makes it still very complex.
Yeah. And that's maybe one of the important messages that we want to give on your way here today, is that just because the data is structured in a certain way and you have a certain number of events, and then out of those you get sequences of events and the variants, like based on the raw data, this is not how you have to keep looking at the data and the process, but you have to think about how you want to look at the process. And to make a meaningful analysis with the variance, you often have to elevate the variance to a higher level, or to a level from a process perspective that you want to see, right? And so we see this here too. So if we look at the map, this is just showing 12%, we can increase it more. But there's so many different steps. But usually you don't want to look at everything at once, right? It's not useful to do this.
Yeah, and there are many ways, right, to try to simplify, right? So there's no one cookbook. So sometimes people ask, okay, but how do I get to the variance, right? So you can develop different strategies in order to get there, and how far you need to get. You have to look at the variance if it starts to make sense, and maybe that's something we can kind of show how that works.
Yeah, we can give an example, right? So based on this clickstream data, so for example here, I think if we focus a little bit on the most common flows, we do see like a certain part of the process that becomes visible, right? It's Should we focus on this one?
So so there's the website, right? And of course, the website has many pages with all with different information, and that's a little bit chaotic. And you can find patterns in there if you want, but where there is a strong pattern is the pattern what you see. So somewhere they just like a checkout on a retail website. This is kind of the application of unemployment benefits. So it has a number of steps, and what you can do is solely focus only on these steps first to simplify. So that's one of the simplification strategies to give focus and focus on particular pages, right? So in this case, the application process, but it could also be the home page in relation to a couple of other pages.
Yeah. So we take here these application pages. So if I can click on this to get to the filter, but then what we want to do is we want to keep only the activities that are related to this part of the process that we are interested in, and we ignore all the events and activities that belong to other parts of the site, right? To focus. So that's a certain way of focus. So for that,
so that's
can match the
application
label,
process,
right? And it's about WW because it's for unemployment insurance, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So if we keep all those,
except the top one.
So I will call this application process. Then we can see as a result, now we can look at everything.
So we see that sequence. So we kind of cut out the part of the bottom part of the process. And you can see on the bottom left that 26% of all the customers that visited the web page have somehow hit one of these pages, right? So we don't know if they hit them all, but at least one.
Yeah, but just 2% of the events, right? So it's from the whole site.
It's
a small percentage. But still complicated, right? So
it's still complicated. And again, if you look at the cases, so that's kind of the check. It's still almost one-to-one, right? So the relationship between the number of cases. So if you look at the complete log overview, it has now 267 cases and 243 different variants. So the conclusion is we are not there yet, right? So it feels like we are closer, but we are not close yet. So if we look at the process map again, we have to find another way to get closer to the variance. So again, ask ourselves the question, what is creating the variation? And another thing that's creating the variation is, of course, the starting point and the end point of this particular process, right? So if we want to cut it out, then we can take the starting point, which should be the first step. And then the last step is the submission of the process.
That's one, but also we have these kind of self loops, right? Do we want to maybe take them out too? Because we...
I think we should take them out as a second step to show what's still causing the complexity. And so I think we should now focus on the starting point. So set.
Okay, so let's say we are diving into this application process now, and looking at the main process. And for this, now we are focusing on certain start and end points. So we focus on all cases that start with what's the expected the first one?
So one easy way to do it is just pull the path slider down, and then you see what's most common starting point here. It's probably that one, but we can see that it's that one. Okay, so let's take that one.
Use that.
And then for the strategy to take the submitted cases, so that's of course, let's do it how we would normally do it. So look at the cases again to see are we already closer to variance? So it's still not significant, right?
Yeah, so we have 170 cases and 165 variants. So still.
Yeah. So what we can do is make it smaller even more, and then look at the cases which are really submitted. So there is a send data step in there, and that results into the submission of the application.
The last one. So that they actually send some data. Okay. So we filter the ones that actually performed this particular step
exactly.
on top of the correct start point.
And now it becomes more simple. But if we look at the variance, so one way to see that it's become more dominant. So if you look at the process map and change to the case frequency instead of the absolute frequency, then you can see
a dominant one.
You can see that we have figured out really a path going to the process. But you can see that if we look at the cases, we haven't found the big variance yet, right? So variance is still very much spread if we look at the cases, and that has a particular reason.
Yes, it's an interesting contrast, because here we can really see a very clear flow, really an expected sequence of steps. But like you're saying, in the variance now, actually we have exactly a 1-to-1 relation. We have 143 cases.
Get worse.
And we have 103 variants. Yes, we have made it worse.
Yeah.
In fact, and if we're looking at them, we can see the reason is, right?
Yeah, there are a lot of repetitions going on. And this is very typical of websites, of course. If you refresh, or if there is some interactions within the page, for example, then you are revisiting the same page. And of course, there could be a different meaning to it, right? So if you add information, right, your employer, for example, if you add multiple employers, then of course, if you had 2, that's different than if you had 3. But in this particular example, if you want to take a look at the route which I took, then it doesn't differentiate, right? So we can simplify by eliminating these repetitions for a big part.
Yes, and we have that as an attribute, right? So let's see where that is. So there's a attribute. It's repetition. And this is sometimes false and true. And if it's true, it means that the previous event was the same. The same type. So there we have these repetitions, and based on this attribute, we can now filter out those repetitions on top. So let's go to the is repetition.
And the is repetition is something we added to the data, right? So it was not there yet, but using the data preparation before we import it into Disco, we have added this attribute to it. So it was already part of the data, of course, but we added this column.
Yeah, and now we can actually see, now we have a different distribution. So now the variants become meaningful, because we have 143 cases and 65 variants. And then with variant 1, we can see it's actually the main process. It's actually the expected sequence, because we have the sequence here. Yeah. And then variant 2 is we get a slight variation, right? But now it's meaningful, and sometimes you have different orders. So so that's an example how you actually worked from this raw data to get it to a level where the variants are meaningful. And maybe so I'm not sure if you wanted to show something else here, because I wanted to show it also based on the other data sets. There's different ways to elevate the data to the level that you wanted to have, right? So for example, if I go back to the refund process, I think we can also show it very nicely here in this process. Again, you get the data in a certain way, but doesn't mean that you have to stick to this set of events like they have fallen out of the system, because most likely the people who recorded the data in the system, they didn't record it to give you the data for your analysis, but it's there for sometimes random reasons, right? Or for some just keeping track, or sometimes there's even very technical information in there, like with some logging about things that happened, but that are not maybe interesting to you for your process analysis at the moment. So you can choose what you want to see. And one way to do that is similar to how we just focused on the application process, on the whole kind of clickstream data. You can do that for any process, right? So for example, here, for this refund process, we can apply the same method, and we often call this milestone method, where you apply the attribute filter in keep selected mode, and then you start with an empty list, and you only select the milestone activities that you really want to see. So often you take the beginning and the end of the process. For example, order created, order completed are like the start and the end points for this refund process, and then you choose the relevant processes in the middle, and that depends what that is, right? This is really like a domain-specific discussion and a domain-specific considerations there. So, for example, maybe the refunds and that were created, maybe if something was changed with the invoice, maybe the pickups, certain pickup steps, or I'm doing this a little bit randomly, but usually you do this very deliberately. And for example, you focus on the 6 or 7 milestones that are the most relevant for your process. So here I have selected 7 now out of the 32, for example. So if I save this as milestones, you can see the effect. And so now we're actually still looking at 100% of the cases, right? You're not losing any cases, but you're leaving out a lot of information, a lot of events in between by only looking at the most important high-level steps in between. So we're looking at 27% of the events. But in this case, I often also can pull up the path slider, and through those milestones, I can now look at everything. Look also at the performance view, for example, see how long it takes to get from one milestone to the next. But this also has some influence on the variance, because now I'm only getting the variance based on those milestones, right? So out of the 1,338 cases, where before I had more than 400 variants, now I only have 31 variants, because I'm only looking at the variance on this milestone level, right? And similar to the repetitions before, when we had this kind of loops where people were clicking on the same site multiple times, they create additional variants. But here, all of the interleavings of the intermediate steps also create variants that fall away if you choose this kind of higher level. So that's something. How do you see this? How really how people are choosing those kind of milestones? It's usually really from a domain perspective, right? That you.
Yeah, and it could even be related to answering specific questions, right? So that it's not just one view, but you create multiple views. One other interesting example. So if we go to the purchasing example, there's also a nice way to view the same principle. So if we look at the map, then it has a lot of these detailed steps. But if a manager, for example, mentions this process, then it could say, this process is not that complicated, right? So it starts with the creation of the purchase requisition, then we create an order, then we get the delivery, then we receive an invoice, and then we pay the invoice, right? So this whole complicated process is kind of described by this manager by only
5 steps or something. Yes.
Yeah, and that's kind of the trigger here already, right? So then you can start with this complicated process, try to explain that manager how it works, but you can also reverse this and then say, let's start with this simple notion of these 5 steps, right? So if we open the filter here, the attribute filter, and doing the same strategy as you have done before, we can select these steps, right? Create purchase requisition as a first step.
Create purchase requisition. Yes.
Create the order as a second step. It's just one above.
Yeah.
Then we have receive goods and deliver goods and service.
Yeah, and pay invoice maybe.
And then send invoice, which is receiving the invoice, and then pay invoice.
Yeah. Or let's say manager milestones. So
manager, And then the process is dull, right? So if we look at the process, it confirms what the manager always mentioned. It's simple. It's not that complicated from this perspective. So also if we look at the variance, it's very dull. So it doesn't have a lot of variance anymore, only 2. But now you can see the power of the simplification, because if the discussion is about the disputes, then we can go back to the selection which we had before and just add these 2 disputes. So we have a financial dispute and a delivery dispute, or dispute with the vendor. So in the context of the simple process, we can add these disputes, which are more exceptional activities, and then show the process based upon these disputes, right? So where do these disputes happen? Is there still more variation going on? And then in the context of the variance, how many of these variants contain disputes? And that's also the power to do this abstraction. Try to find a way that these variants become not too complicated anymore, and then start to go down and then add more detail to it, and then add more variance to it as well.
That's a great example. And also, what you mentioned, that this comes from the subject matter expert or the manager describing the process. That's a great starting point for choosing kind of a view or kind of a high-level view of your process. Try to find this back in the data, because this is aligned with how people think about the process, right? So you can create views on the process and variants that are meaningful to the people who are living in this process. So that's exactly what you want.
And there are two approaches, right? You can have the top-down approach, what we have just shown, but you can also have that bottom-up approach, right? To try to simplify it again, find a new strategy to simplify it further till these variants become meaningful.
Yes. Maybe one point of attention that we wanted to give on your way. So you have to be careful and keep in mind that the variants, they're always recalculated, right? So that's exactly like what we are seeing here. That's, of course, the power of them. Like, for example, based on these 5 milestones from the manager, then we were looking at disputes. So now we are seeing kind of 6 different variants on that level. These variants have been recalculated based on the chosen activities, right? And something similar happens, for example, if you split up the process. Maybe that's also something to show. So if we are looking at the purchasing process, it could be that you're meeting with, let's say, the financial manager, who is not at all responsible for the whole purchase order and purchase order handling part, but only for the invoice handling part of the process. So then we see that basically starts after send invoice and then the steps afterwards. So you might want to focus on this part of the process with this person. And to do this, you can use the endpoint filter in trim mode, where you can say, for example, after send invoice, the process starts, and you keep everything that happens afterwards, right? So invoicing only. So if you do this, of course, the process map now is focused on this aspect or this part of the process. But you can also look at the statistics. For example, now the throughput time, durations and everything is focused only on this part of the process, but also the variance, right? So here the variance again are recalculated, and then we can see there's just 3 variants, because there's just 3 variants or 3 ways to go through this this invoicing part of the process. So keep this in mind, because as we have shown before, you can filter based on the variants. But if you want to, for example, filter based on variants that you have created after applying other filters, you have to create a new baseline. For example, here, if we want to be able to filter variant 1, 2, 3 that we have created out of the 98 or something variants that were there before, what you can do there is always that you can make a copy, and you can check this box which says apply filters permanently, and then usually this is what you do when you're creating a baseline for your analysis. And let's call it baseline. And so you have the same outcome as you had before, but you're kind of resetting the outcome as the new reference. So then when you go and either apply the variation filter that we have shown before, or you're filtering variance explicitly, so now you have the variance that you have newly created. So that's something to keep in mind. So that's something we wanted to give on your way. So what's next?
So maybe this is a good point to show that the statistics also has a variance, right? So if we look at the example which we created with the disputes.
So with the disputes, where we added the disputes to the high-level process view?
Yeah, exactly. So if we, for example, now take a look at the cases, so some of these variants contain disputes, right? So if we look at the cases here, and we go through each of these cases, then the first ones, of course, probably these are the mainstream examples, right?
And so this one has a dispute already.
Exactly. So variant 3 has a dispute, variant 4 maybe, variant 4, and then variant 5 and 6 probably also. Yeah. So what we can do is, if we look at the statistics.
The statistics, yes.
And if we look at the variance here, so in the table underneath the graph, there is case statistics, right? So for every case, it gives you the statistics about the lead time and the number of steps it had taken, but it can also be grouped as part of the variance. And now you can kind of see if these variants, so not variant 1 and 2, right? But from variant 3 all the way to variant 6, do they actually take more time because they have a dispute? And how much more time do they take, right? So that's now what you can see as part of the statistics, right? So variant 3, that's not too bad, actually. But if we look at variant 5, a significant time is being added to that variant. So the impact of that variant is very high. And so, of course, having a dispute doesn't really have to have a big impact on the lead time. But if we look at variant 3, it has, right? So then we can specifically, also variant 5, if you look at variant 5, it has. So we can specifically look at variant 5 to see what's actually happening with a particular variant.
Yeah, so we can, and then of course in Disco we can look at the variants directly, can go to that variant like we just did from the statistics, and then we see examples for that variant. Here we have 2 and see different incarnations of this same behavior. But what maybe also be interesting or good for you to know is that you can also export these statistics, right? So for example, if you want to share them with the manager for this process who's responsible, who wants to see this. So if you, any table in Disco, if you click on it, you can say export to CSV, and then you can export here on the desktop, for example, variance in disputes, and then if I go there, for example, here I can see that actually the exported data does contain all the statistics that we see in Disco, but also the steps themselves, actually. So the step 1, step 2, step 3. So the sequences of activities that make up the variant is also included in the export, because of course outside of Disco, variant 1, variant 2, variant 3 does not really say that much anymore. So you have this full information available, and we have seen some nice examples what people do with those kind of exports, right, Rudi?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we have an example. I think we had a Café session in the past, also with Mutu from Philips, and he is using these exports to calculate the capability of a process, right? So using the variance to calculate the process capability and the variation of it in order to understand which of these variants have problems with it to be able to take appropriate action.
Yeah, exactly. So we will link this also with the show notes.
Yeah. So we also have a question from the chat. So Manfred is asking if Disco can create a simulation model out of the process maps. So maybe that's something also interesting to show how the variance can be a very powerful mechanism to combine process mining with simulation as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, so you can, based on the variance, you can make some projections, right? What if, for example, if you could reduce certain variance, what would be the effect of it?
Yeah. So Disco itself is focused on process discovery and process analysis, right? So it doesn't have simulation capability, but using Disco, you can use the actual data in order to construct a simulation model. So maybe if we go to the purchasing example, we can show how you can use the notion of variance in order to populate or create a simulation model, right? So if we have this purchasing example, if we look at the cases, then we have these 608 cases, which have 98 different variants. So the 98 different variants creates a very complicated simulation model, right? So it really requires a lot of parameters to build. So the question is, do you want to have this? And this model is specifically built then on this data set, right? So it's very much... it's not generalized, so it's kind of it would be overfitted. So we want to have kind of a more generalized model. And I think if we use here the variation filter again, we can do this quite easily, right? So if we use the variation filter and we cut out the left point of the distribution here a bit, the exceptions, and create and generalize this model using this notion, then we can quickly get a view of this process maps, which is more generalized and ready for constructing a simulation model. And so if you look at the map is much more simple. You can even add filters like these dotted lines here. Oh, that's weird, right? So we don't want to have these cases that end at a different endpoint. We only want to have these cases that go from start to finish. So we can add a filter here. For example, only filter completed cases to simplify even more.
Yeah, so we only keep the ones that really arrive at the endpoint.
Yeah. And now we have a model where both the activity sliders and path sliders are up. That then can be used as a basis to construct the simulation model. And we can use this model by exporting it, right? So we have an export function where we can export this into an XML format that can be used as a starting point for simulation or constructing and populating the simulation model. And of course, you can use the statistics as well, right? So you can either use the distributions or use the median values of the processing time or the lead time of these processes.
Yeah, that's exactly the power of cross mining, of course, that you can get all this data-based information, this factual information to populate your simulation model in the right way. So maybe we can also point to this. We have had one or two, but at least one really detailed process mining café about combining process mining with simulation. So to do a real simulation, you need like a simulation tool, but process mining gives you all the ingredients that you need, and we show exactly how to combine it. At the same time, there are quite a lot of what-if analysis that you can do without a simulation tool, just based on the process mining analysis. And so we will link to this, and so there, for this kind of question, you can dive into that.
It's a whole different topic.
It's a whole different topic, yes. But coming back to the variants, I think what we have shown is that they're there. They're kind of a separate dimension. We don't just have the process map, but we have the variants also as these different sequences and scenarios. And we work with them together. We have seen that we need to, in order to have meaningful variants, we have to create them on the right level. This means selecting the right steps, or cutting out the right part of the process, or making the right selection in your data, so that afterwards you get variants that are meaningful, and then you can do all kinds of analysis with the variants. And there we see people also apply different approaches. So for example, I've seen one customer who is really focusing on creating standardization. So for them, it's important to have less variation in the way that they perform their process. So they want to reduce the number of variants, and they're looking, for example, at the top 80% of their cases, and they want to see as few variants as possible. So if they can reduce from 7 to 3 variants, that's their goal, and that's a good outcome for them. What other kind of analysis scenarios have you seen really based on variants once they are on the right level, let's say?
So one interesting strategy was more from an auditing point of view, where they looked then at meaningful variants, right? And then find this cutoff point of mainstream variants that are immediately accepted, right? So they looked at the resulting process map of the 80%, and then say, that's logical, right? So this is kind of what we accept as the mainstream process. And then they just looked at the rest to see what kind of risk is in there, right? So, and that's also easy because it's a positive story, right? So in 80% of the cases, you follow the process, but it also simplifies matters because you just focus on the 20%, what's left, and then kind of cherry pick from the 20% to see what are more risky deviations from the process, and then see what kind of mitigations you want to introduce to prevent this in the future. So that was also a very powerful way to use the variance and to simplify the analysis itself.
Yeah, that's a great example. Yes. So normally it's the opposite from what we showed before, right? Where you focus on the main variants, but they're actually, this is what we already know. So we set this aside and we focus on
the exceptions.
What's maybe not expected. Yes.
Yeah, and there what we also saw in the example is that you just need to leave out a couple of these activities, right? So it's similar to the strategy which we have seen, for example, by the manager saying we just need 5 activities, but in that particular example, they just left out 3 or 4 of these activities, and then from there it was already creating a more mainstream type of process. So excluding some of the high repeating activities. That's often what we call the spider activities, things that happen in between, but are not very structured.
They're just creating variance, but not in a meaningful way. Yes. Yes, and maybe two things that I had in mind that I also wanted to give on your way is that, first of all, sometimes you need to be careful maybe just looking at the number of variants, because you also have to look at them in relation to the volume, right? The number of cases that you're looking at. For example, to illustrate it, I can go back to the refund process here, where actually if we're looking at this map, then we are looking at different processes in one picture, because in fact, when we imported, we saw that there's this channel attribute and there's 3 different channels through which the refund order can be started. And for example, if we are looking at the internet channel, we can filter for all the cases that come through internet refunds. And so there we are seeing actually a much smaller process, right? So here, where, for example, if we are looking at the number of variants, we just see 43 variants, right, for this process. While if we look at the dealer process, where you go back to the shop where you bought the product to return it, dealer refunds, for example, then we can see there's 367 variants. But at the same time, we're looking at a much larger data set. So here we're looking at 1,200 cases, almost 90% of all the data. While through the internet, we're only looking at 6% of the cases, 83. So so that's also something you can take into account when you make the analysis. So be careful, have the variance on the right level, but then also think about what do you want to measure and what's the goal behind it. And like we've seen, it really depends, right? What you want to do. Standardization, compliance.
Yeah, and in addition to that is if you compare variants with each other, then you need to be careful that the processes are at the same level, right? So they describe the similar activities, otherwise it's not fair, right? So if one process is described in very detailed ways with all these detailed activities and the other process is more coarse-grained, then of course there will be a big difference between the number of variants that can occur.
Yeah, so don't just go to the variants and take them as they are, but be mindful about this. Yes. So do we have some last words or some recommendations that we forgot so far?
No, I think it's more a summary, right? So if we look at the variants, I think it's, besides the process map, a very powerful characteristic of the process itself. And especially if you look at the goal of your analysis, it can be used as a means to get to that goal, right? So to find the right level of the process, the right abstraction level, so that your analysis become meaningful. So I often use it kind of as an anchor point. So where am I at, and what kind of steps do I still need to take in order to get there? So somehow I see myself working my way towards a meaningful viewpoint of the variation, right? Where things become more dominant or more meaniful. And that kind of helps me to decide how much do I need to leave out to get there. Am I too far, or do I still have some work to do to get there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And also, what I have to think about again, before we started the session today, we were talking about this, that's actually also one of the powers of process mining, right? That you, if you're doing just some kind of brown paper sessions or some kind of manual interview-based analysis, you can often find the low-hanging fruits. You can find the things that people already know that are happening, and often these are the main variants, for example, that you can find. So they're often not that unexpected, right? But with process mining, you can see everything. So that's really the power that you can, for example, like you mentioned, maybe leave out the main variants, but focus on the 40% least frequent variants, because there's potential for improvement that you otherwise couldn't get to.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a good closing words about the power of process mining. You see, it's not that simple. There are a lot of things you need to think about when you do it, actually, when you do the analysis. Make sure things are on the right level. Make sure you're not comparing apples with oranges. So that's, of course, what we are also going to talk about for 2 days during process mining camp. So we hope you can join us there. Like we said, get your ticket until Friday next week to benefit from the springtime saver reduction that's still available right now. And then, stay tuned for the full program, which will be announced next week. So thanks, everyone. See you at camp.
See you at camp. Bye.